Let's take a look at Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, and we're going to focus between 1948 and 1991. And here we can see Eastern Europe, the Soviets' huge sphere of influence over Eastern Europe after World War II. As you can see, it occupies all of East Germany with the Iron Curtain right here going down from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic Sea. So let's take a look at some of the important events that occurred in Eastern Europe. So let's take a look at our basic timeline. In 1956, we have the Hungarian uprising. So we have an uprising in Hungary right here. And one of the most significant figures is Imre Nagy, who was a communist politician. He tried to gain independence for Hungary from the Soviet Union. He tried to gain independence, but that then ended up costing him his life, and the Hungarian uprising failed, but we'll take a look at that in more detail later. In 1961, we have the Berlin Wall built. So there's a wall in Berlin, which was built in 1961. In 1968, with the Czechoslovakian uprising, so an uprising in Czechoslovakia, another attempt to gain independence from the USSR, to lose the control of them. They were bitter towards the USSR. They hated being in control of them, who controlled their freedoms tightly. And the Czechoslovakian uprising is also known as the Prague Spring, because it was in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, right here, Prague. And the guy who was the leader of Czechoslovakia, who tried to free Czechoslovakia, the stringent restrictions, who tried to give Czechoslovakia independence, is Alexander Dubček. Alexander Dubček. So he was a leader at the time who tried to reduce Russian control of Czechoslovakia, but it failed once again. We go into more detail later. Between 1980 and 1982, we have unrest in Poland. So Poland is starting to actually become Poland right here, is becoming disliking Soviet rule. We have the role of Solidarity, which was a group. It was an independent trade union in Poland who fought for workers' rights. We'll look into more detail in that later. And the leader of Solidarity was Lech Walesa. In 1989, we had the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. So all these communist countries in Eastern Europe, they all end up removing communist control. So all these Eastern European countries actually remove communist control. And a side note is that Romania removed communist control violently. So Romania had some difficulty doing so. But we'll go into detail in that later. So in 1990, Germany was reunified after 45 years. I mean, the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic were created in May 1949. But Germany had been split up via Yalta since 1945, so it had been 45 years since Germany had been split apart. So it was now finally reunified. Since communism had collapsed, it was able to finally reunify itself, since communism had collapsed in all these countries in Eastern Europe, including East Germany. And in 1991, with the collapse of the USSR under Mikhail Gorbachev, it finally collapses. So let's take a look at what happened during the Hungarian uprising of 1956. So as we know, Stalin reigns for 29 years between 1924 and he dies in 1953. So the death of Stalin leads many Hungarians, so we're looking at Hungary here, We're looking at Hungary. It leads many Hungarians to hope that Hungary will be free. They hope that it will be de-Stalinized. They disliked Soviet rule for reasons we'll come to later. So in July 1956, the Stalinist leader, Rákosi, actually fell from power. In October 1956, students, workers, and soldiers in Hungary attacked the secret police, Russian soldiers, and smashed a statue of Stalin. In 1956, also in October 1956, Imre Nagy, a moderate and a westernizer, so he didn't like Soviet rule either, he took over as prime minister. Nagy actually asked Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader at the time, to move the Russian troops out of Budapest. Khrushchev agreed, and they pulled out of Budapest, so the Russian troops actually moved out of Budapest. So the Russian troops moved out. Let me do that in a different color. So the Russian troops moved out of Budapest. So after the troops pulled out in October, out of Budapest, the Russian troops pulled out, there was freedom in Hungary for 5 days. The new Hungarian government introduced democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And yeah, so this is great. However, in November 1956, Nagy announced that Hungary would actually leave the Warsaw Pact, but Khrushchev was not going to allow this. And Khrushchev claimed that he'd received a letter from the Hungarian communist leaders asking for his help. So, the day later, on the 4th of November, so on the 3rd, Nagy announced Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact. The next day, on the 4th, 1,000 Russian tanks rolled into Budapest. So 1,000 Russian tanks actually rolled back into Budapest. They destroyed the Hungarian army and captured Hungarian radio. The last broadcast words were help, help, help. Hungarian people, even children, fought the Russian troops with machine guns. Some 4,000 Hungarians were killed. 4,000 Hungarians were killed. And Khrushchev put in a Russian supporter, Janos Kadar, as prime minister, replacing Imre Nagy. So Nagy was executed on charges of treason 2 years later. So it cost him his life, this attempted uprising. But at least he tried to fight for the Hungarian people's freedom. So what were the causes of the Hungarian uprising? Why did it even occur in the first place? And the major cause was the Hungarians were patriotic and hated Russian control. The Hungarians were patriotic, and hated Russian control. Obviously, Hungary had been controlled by Russia since 1945, after the Second World War. They hated Russian control. Why did they hate Russian control? And this was because of censorship, strict Russian censorship in Hungary, a general lack of freedom. And the Russians controlled the economy, which made Hungary poor. And we also have a secret police, which was despised because it threatened people. We look at some effects of the Hungarian Revolution, or the Hungarian Uprising. We have repression in Hungary. Thousands of Hungarians were arrested and imprisoned. So we have thousands arrested and imprisoned. Some people were even executed. And 200,000 refugees fled. 200,000 refugees fled to Austria. So as you can see, Austria is not part of Russian control. So they fled to Austria. And so we see also that Russia stayed in control behind the Iron Curtain. So it maintained its control of its current Iron Curtain. No other country tried to get rid of Russian troops until Czechoslovakia in 1968. And another effect was the polarization of the Cold War. So people in the West were horrified. Many communists left the Communist Party, and Western leaders became more determined to contain communism. So let's talk about this Prague Spring of 1968. And the Prague Spring was a period where Czechoslovakia actually broke free from Soviet rule, allowing freedom of speech and removing some state controls. So this 4-month period when they broke free from Soviet rule is known as the Prague Spring. So let's look at some of the events that led to this and why did it only last for 4 months. So in 1967, students and writers were complaining about the lack of freedom and the poor performance of the Czechoslovak economy. So Novotny, the Czechoslovak president at the time, asked the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev for help because the economy was bad. There was a lack of freedom. So Novotny asked for help from the Soviet leader, but Brezhnev did not support his ambitions. So then Novotny eventually fell from power. And then Alexander Dubček, this gentleman right here, Alexander Dubček, who was a reformer. He took over as leader of the Communist Party, which was also called the KSC, the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. So Alexander Dubček right here was a reformer. Alexander Dubček. So then Dubček announced his action plan for socialism with a human face. So it's basically a redefined version of socialism to make it a bit better for the people so that we have removal of state controls over industry. So we're basically moving away from a command economy towards a mixed or a market economy. And we also have freedom of speech. That's his action plan, socialism with a human face. So for 4 months during the Prague Spring, there was actually freedom in Czechoslovakia. But then the revolution began to run out of control. Dubček announced that he was still committed to democratic communism, so he's still a communist, and communism is the only party you can really vote for. But other political parties were beginning to be set up, and the Soviet Union wouldn't be too happy about that. So Dubček stressed and tried to assure the Soviet Union that Czechoslovakia would stay in the Warsaw Pact. It wouldn't make the same mistake as the Hungarians and try and leave the Warsaw Pact. But Tito, the Yugoslavia's president at the time, actually visited Prague. And the thing about Tito is that Yugoslavia actually wasn't in the Warsaw Pact. So the Soviet Union wasn't happy that these guys were having relations. So at a meeting in Bratislava, which is in Czechoslovakia, in August 1968, Brezhnev read out a letter from some Czechoslovakian communists who were asking for help. These Czechoslovakian communists weren't happy about what was happening in Czechoslovakia. They were saying these other parties were being set up, the revolution was getting out of control, Czechoslovakia was straying away from communism. So we have these Czechoslovakian communists actually asking the Soviet leader Brezhnev for help. So then Brezhnev released the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said the USSR would not allow any Eastern European country to reject communism. So it's making a firm stance there. So then, because of the Brezhnev Doctrine, we have 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invade Czechoslovakia in August 1968. Dubček and 3 other leaders were arrested and sent to Moscow. And the thing about this is the Czechoslovakians did not fight the Russians. Instead, they stood in front of the tanks and put flowers in the soldiers' hair. And a guy called Jan Palach burned himself to death in protest, but they didn't fight the Russians like the Hungarians did in the Hungarian uprising, 1956. And then finally, where Brezhnev put in Gustav Husek, who was a supporter of Russia, as the new leader of the Communist Party after Dubček was arrested. We can quickly look at the causes of the Prague Spring in 1968. So here we have Czechoslovakia and Prague. Why did the Prague Spring occur? Similar to the reasons a Hungarian uprising occurred in 1956. The Czechs hated Russian control. The Russians controlled the Czech economy, which they claim made Czechoslovakia poor, because it was all for the benefit of the Soviets, wasn't it? And we also have censorship and a lack of freedom as another reason why the Czechs hated Russian control. And we also have some Czechs who believe the USA would help them. So if they had an uprising, the USA would come to their aid as a Western power. How about effects of the Czechoslovakian uprising? What happened because of it? The first was that Czechoslovakia was just returned back to communist control, back to the control of the Soviets. Russian troops were stationed there. Half the leadership of the Communist Party, along with the directors of many firms, were sacked, and 47 anti-communists were arrested, so it went back to Russian control. Another effect is that Russia maintained its control of the Iron Curtain. So it stayed in control behind the Iron Curtain here. It kept all of its countries inside the Iron Curtain. And the Brezhnev Doctrine stated that the Iron Curtain countries would not be allowed to abandon communism, even if it meant a third world war. And the final effect was the increase in tension of the Cold War. So the people in the West were horrified about the Soviets marching into Czechoslovakia. And so many communist countries were also horrified, especially Romania and Yugoslavia, over what the Soviets did. So sending 500,000 Warsaw troops to march in and arrest Dubček. Now let's talk about the Berlin Wall, which was built in 1961 and taken down in 1989. So it lasted 28 years. By the 1960s, Berlin was still divided. The USSR controlled the East, and the USA guaranteed freedom in the West. However, thousands of refugees escaped to West Berlin each day, much to the embarrassment of the USSR. So in 1961, Khrushchev closed the border and ordered the construction of a wall to stop people from leaving. So here we can see an actual picture of the Berlin Wall right here. This is a real picture of the Berlin Wall. So West Berlin, this free and prosperous West Berlin, was really an embarrassment for the Soviet Union in 1961. Nearly 2,000 refugees a day were fleeing to the west through West Berlin. So 2,000 refugees a day were actually fleeing from East Berlin to West Berlin. This was hardly proof of the Soviet claim that the communist way of life was better than capitalism if all these refugees are fleeing. And many of those people leaving were actually skilled and qualified workers. So skilled and qualified workers were often leaving, which inevitably left the USSR in a worse position. You don't want to be left with a country with unskilled people. So the Soviets also believed, they had suspected, and rightly suspected, that the USSR was kind of spying on East Berlin, that they were using West Berlin as a center for US espionage. So the US was kind of spying on East Berlin here. So they were kind of using this line, the center, they were using West Berlin for US espionage, US spying, which Khrushchev wasn't happy about, US espionage. Spying on the Soviet Union. So, on June 1961, at the Vienna summit, Khrushchev demanded that the US actually leave West Berlin within 6 months. Kennedy refused and instead guaranteed West Berlin's freedom. So on August, Khrushchev closed the border between East and West Berlin, and started building the Berlin Wall. At first, Russians regarded it as a propaganda success, but as time went on, it became a propaganda disaster, a symbol of all that was bad about Soviet rule. So I want to look at some of the ways the Berlin Wall was a symbol of the Cold War. How was the Berlin Wall a symbol of the Cold War? Firstly, it was a concrete version of the Iron Curtain. So we have a clear division between capitalism and communism. It also symbolized the divided world. It also showed that the differences between capitalism and communism, these ideologies, led to a real-life physical division. This is a physical division between capitalism and communism here, which shows that these ideologies actually lead to real physical division. It's not just opposing ideas, it actually leads to palpable, tangible division. It was also a concrete symbol of the ideological divisions between the free world and the communist world. The free world is now clearly separated from the communist world, and it's a concrete symbol of these ideological divisions. It was also concrete proof that capitalists could never work with communists after this division. So to quickly recap, 2,000 East German refugees were fleeing to West Berlin each day by 1961, and the Soviets accused the Americans of using Berlin for US espionage. And the summit of 1961 was held at Vienna, and Khrushchev demanded at the Vienna 1961 summit that America should leave West Berlin within 6 months, but Kennedy refused because Berlin was a symbol of freedom. And Kennedy actually visited Berlin in 1961. But Russia responded by building the Berlin Wall in August, on the 13th of August 1961. Now I want to talk about Poland and solidarity. Poland and solidarity between 1980 and 1982. So it's important to see the bigger picture here. We're getting towards the end of the Cold War. The communist government in Russia is really disintegrating due to the economic pressures, the war in Afghanistan, and the revolts which are occurring in Eastern Europe. So both Gorbachev and Reagan played major roles in ending the Cold War, but with the failure of communism in Eastern Europe, so opposition to Soviet policies were growing in other associated states of Eastern Europe. The majority of people were against Soviet interference and the presence of the Red Army in the Eastern Bloc, or in the satellite states. For instance, we had Poland and solidarity between 1980 and 1982. So widespread anger and unrest hit Poland in the early 1980s. There were protests over food shortages and the price of consumer products. So food shortages, there wasn't enough food to feed the people, and the price of consumer products was too high. And so we have an independent trade union led by Lech Walesa called Solidarity, which was established in the early 1980s. So an independent trade union led by Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa. So Solidarity really wanted to end Soviet control of the country. Led by Lech Walesa, it encouraged continued protest against the government. Solidarity quickly gained 10 million members. So it wanted to end Soviet control, encourage protests against the government, and it had around 10 million members. 10 million members, which is incredible. So of course, under Soviet pressures, under Soviet guidance, the revolt was suppressed by the Polish army, and by early 1982, Solidarity was banned and its leaders arrested. But it wasn't over just yet. The US worked secretly with the Catholic Church to undermine communist control of Poland. So the US helped the Catholic Church undermine the communist control of Poland. Finances were provided by the West towards the movement, and Pope John Paul II, himself a Pole, helped to secure the release of Solidarity members directly. The CIA also provided Solidarity with communication technology to keep the movement alive. The Polish economy continued to decline as it was in Soviet rule. And in 1988, protests again spread throughout the country. Many workers illegally went on strike. This led to talks between the Solidarity leadership and the Polish government. So 1988, Polish economy continues to decline, protests spread, workers will go on strike, and this finally leads to a talk between the Solidarity leaders and the Polish government. So a compromise can be made, and by early 1989, an agreement was made to hold new elections with a reduced influence for the communists guaranteed. And Solidarity was also legalized and was able to form a coalition without the Communist Party, establishing an anti-communist government. So Solidarity was legalized. Solidarity was legalized. So this unrest in these European countries also contributed towards the end of the Cold War. The power of the people will eventually come to fruition. And I quickly want to go over the collapse of communism, not only in Eastern Europe, but also in the USSR itself. So the decline of communism was not a result of American policies in the Cold War, but more had to do with the problems faced by the USSR at home and abroad. Specific events led to its collapse. So let's have a look at the end of the Cold War. So in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And it invaded Afghanistan to try propping up the communist government there, which was being attacked by Muslim Mujahideen fighters. This immediately caused a rift with the United States, which boycotted the 1980 Olympics. So because of the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan, Reagan actually boycotts the 1980 Olympics. Boycotts 1980 Olympics. So in 1980, Reagan was the president of the United States. He became president, and as a strong anti-communist, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire and increased spending on arms. The US developed the neutron bomb, cruise missiles, and a Star Wars defense system using space satellites. By 1985, the Soviet Union was in trouble. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the USSR. So in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the USSR. So Gorbachev did a whole bunch of significant things. Let's look at some of them. He withdrew from Afghanistan. He realized the USSR could not afford the arms race, so he signed the Strategic Arms Reduction talks with the United States and also signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, basically eliminating shorter and intermediate range nuclear missiles for safety. He also completely reformed the Soviet system with perestroika, basically allowing competition in business, so more of a transition toward a market economy rather than a command economy in a traditional communist sense, and also glasnost, honesty or freedom, so it's more of less censorship here. And as in 1956 and 1968, so with the Hungarian and Prague Spring, a relaxation by the Soviet government encouraged revolutions. Obviously, all these relaxations are going to encourage revolutions in Eastern Europe. Only this time the USSR did not have the means or the will to impose military control after Gorbachev took power. In June 1989, there were free elections in Poland, and Solidarity won. It was originally a banned trade union, but Lech Walesa became the first non-communist president of Poland. And there were revolutions in other countries which quickly followed, notably the November 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall. So East and West Berlin are now united once again, and in 1991 Gorbachev fell from power and the Soviet Union was dissolved. So Gorbachev fell from power, and the USSR was dissolved. I'll quickly look at some problems facing the USSR in the 1980s, which could have potentially contributed towards its collapse. So Afghanistan had become Russia's Vietnam. Afghanistan was being invaded by another organization that was too difficult for the USSR to control. And so in a sense, it had become Russia's Vietnam, something it just couldn't control anymore. Russia couldn't not afford the arms race, so it had to have negotiations with the US over this. And the Soviet economy was backwards. For instance, its factories and mines were decrepit and outdated. And its backward industry also caused increasing environmental problems, for instance, pollution and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion of 1986. And the Aral Sea dried up. The Aral Sea dried up. Many people were much poorer than even the poorest in the West, and unrest about shortages was growing, shortages of food to feed people. Crime, alcoholism, and drugs were out of control in Soviet towns. The Soviet system had become corrupt and out of date. For instance, instead of dealing with problems, the government just covered them up, like in the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. It covered that up instead of dealing with it. And finally, many people were dissatisfied with the Soviet police state and censorship.